politics and Ivy got tales to share. Life in general, we go everywhere. From politics to soul repair. Tune in now, we got time to spare.
All right, so today we're diving deep into a Joe Rogan Experience episode, and this one features a biblical scholar named Wesley Huff.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating conversation, especially because it's actually kind of spun out of a debate that Huff had with, I guess you could call him an alternative history enthusiast by the name of Billy Carson.
Oh, interesting. So we've got like a clash of worldviews here.
Yeah, exactly. And, Rogan, he kind of acknowledges in the episode that sometimes it's more entertaining to just listen to someone who's a captivating speaker.
Right.
Even if what they're saying is maybe a little questionable.
It's funny you say that because I think we've all been there, right? Like you get swept up in a good story and then later you're like, wait a minute, does that actually add up?
Yeah, totally. It's that balance between wanting to be entertained and also wanting to, stay informed and not get taken in by things that aren't, entirely accurate.
And in this case, it sounds like that debate had some real-world consequences.
Yeah, so apparently Carson wasn't too happy with how the debate went and actually tried to pursue legal action against Huff and some others involved.
Seriously?
Yeah, it gets pretty wild. But from what I gathered from the episode, his claims didn't seem to hold much water legally.
Well, that's a whole other deep dive for another time. But what I'm really curious about is this Wesley Huff. What makes him such a standout figure in the world of biblical scholarship?
One thing that really struck me was how he emphasizes the sheer depth of ancient studies.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Like he talks about the years, decades even, of research that goes into it.
Wow.
And the mastery of ancient languages,
Yeah, I can only imagine.
To really understand these texts at a deep level, it's not just, casual reading. It's a serious commitment.
Right, because we're talking about languages that, in many cases, we don't even know the exact pronunciation of. Right?
Exactly. So you're trying to reconstruct not just the meaning of the words, but also how they were spoken, the context in which they were used.
Mm-hmm. It's like a whole other level of detective work.
Yeah, and you can really sense that dedication in Huff's own story.
Yeah.
He talks about how he faced a serious illness as a child. And that experience, I think, really shaped his perspective on life and faith.
It's often those defining moments that lead us down unexpected paths.
Yeah, for sure. And he was also exposed to a lot of different religious viewpoints growing up, which probably contributed to his, his interest in biblical studies.
So instead of pushing him away from religion, those challenges actually drew him deeper in.
It seems that way, yeah.
Yeah.
And you know what else is interesting? He actually considered joining the police force before dedicating himself to scholarship.
Whoa, really? That's a pretty big shift.
I know, right? But maybe there's a connection there, like this underlying drive to uncover the truth.
I like that, yeah. Whether it's solving crimes or piecing together ancient texts, there's a common thread of seeking answers.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another point that Rogan and Huff touch on the power of confidence.
Uh-oh, this sounds intriguing.
They talk about how easily we can be swayed by someone who speaks with authority, even if, their expertise might be questionable.
Oh, I've definitely fallen for that before. Like you think, well, they sound so sure of themselves, they must know what they're talking about.
It's a natural human tendency, I think.
It is. But how do we as listeners, as critical thinkers, how do we guard against that? How do we know when we're being sold a bill of goods, so to speak?
It's a tough one, for sure. But I think, one thing to watch out for is whether a speaker cites their sources. Are they transparent about their biases? Do they acknowledge any counter-arguments? Things like that.
Right. So it's not just about what they say, but how they say it and whether they're willing to engage with different perspectives.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think it's okay to be skeptical, to question things, and to not be afraid to say, hey, I need a little more evidence before I buy into this.
That's great advice. Now, before we get too deep into the weeds, I want to touch on this concept of methodology. Huff mentions this term, historiography, which might sound intimidating, but he explains it in a way that makes it pretty accessible.
Yeah, think of it like this. It's not just about what happened in the past, but how we know what happened.
Right, so it's the methods, the tools, the frameworks that historians use.
Exactly, like how do they evaluate sources? How do they piece together a narrative that's as accurate and as, unbiased as possible?
So it's kind of like being a detective for history.
I like that analogy. And, Huff even talks about using these paratextual features.
Textual features.
Yeah, like think about the spacing in an ancient manuscript. The punctuation, the margins, all those little details can actually reveal a lot about how a text was composed and transmitted over time.
So you're saying that even the seemingly insignificant stuff can hold clues?
Yeah, it's like every mark on the page tells a story.
I love that. And speaking of stories, Huff shares this really cool anecdote about handling an original manuscript that was actually touched by Pope John Paul II.
Wow, that's amazing.
Right. Talk about a tangible link to the past. Like, you're holding something that was held by a major figure in history.
It really brings it all to life, doesn't it? It's not just abstract ideas anymore. It's real people, real objects, real events that shaped the world we live in.
Absolutely. And that leads us to our next topic, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, these scrolls are like a time capsule from ancient times.
Yeah, their discovery was huge. Like, imagine pushing back our understanding of the Old Testament by 1,000 years. It's mind-blowing.
That's insane. It's like finding out everything you thought you knew about a subject was off by a millennium.
It completely changes the timeline.
Exactly. And what's really remarkable is how well preserved some of these texts are.
Yeah, like the Isaiah scroll, for example. It's incredibly accurate compared to later copies.
Really?
Yeah, it suggests that the scribes who copied these texts were incredibly meticulous.
Yeah.
It's
like they knew they were preserving something incredibly important.
Yeah, and that they had to get it right.
It's a testament to the power of these texts and the reverence people had for them.
Definitely. And then, you've got the Copper Scroll, which is a whole other story.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that one.
So this scroll is basically an ancient treasure map. And it's super detailed, like it lists specific locations and quantities of buried riches.
Wait, seriously, like X marks the spot kind of stuff?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about a small stash here. It's like 65 tons of gold, 26 tons of silver, all kinds of precious stuff.
That's straight out of an Indiana Jones movie. I wonder if anyone's ever tried to follow those instructions and actually find the treasure.
Oh, I'm sure they have. But who knows what they found, or if it's even still out there.
That's the thing about history, right? It's full of mysteries and unanswered questions.
Yeah, and that's part of what makes it so fascinating,
Absolutely. Now, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we move on to the New Testament. Huff points out that there are actually way more early Christian manuscripts compared to older texts.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It suggests that Christians were very intentional about spreading their message.
Like they wanted to make sure their teachings reached as many people as possible.
Exactly. And that meant making copies and distributing them far and wide.
It makes you wonder, what were the historical factors that contributed to that? Were they facing persecution? Were they trying to convert people?
All good questions, It's a reminder that historical context is crucial for understanding these texts.
Totally. And even with all that careful copying, there's still a human element involved, right?
Whoa, yeah, for sure. Huff actually tells this funny story about a scribe who messed up Matthew's genealogy.
Oh, no. He got the family tree wrong.
Yeah, he just totally botched it.
That's hilarious. Even those tasked with preserving sacred texts were prone to the occasional blunder.
It makes you realize that they were just people. Fallible humans like the rest of us.
It kind of humanizes those ancient figures in a way.
Definitely. It's a reminder that these texts, despite their sacred status, were ultimately transmitted and preserved by real people with all their quirks and imperfections.
It makes you wonder, what other little mistakes or variations might be hidden within these ancient texts?
Oh, I'm sure there are plenty more.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where textual criticism comes in, Scholars have developed all these methods to analyze and compare different manuscripts, to trace their origins, and to try to reconstruct the most accurate version of the original text.
It's like they're linguistic detectives piecing together the history of words and phrases.
It's amazing work, really. And speaking of deciphering mysteries, Huff also touches on the challenges of understanding lost languages like Sumerian and Linear Elamite.
Oh, wow. Yeah, those are languages that have no close linguistic relatives, right?
Exactly. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
My brain hurts just thinking about it. Where do you even begin with something like that?
It takes a special kind of dedication, that's for sure. He mentions this guy, Rick Strassman, who spent 16 years teaching himself ancient Hebrew.
16 years?
Yeah, just so he could read the Bible in its original language.
Wow, talk about commitment. I can barely commit to learning a new phrase in another language, let alone tackling an entire ancient one.
It's inspiring, though, isn't it? It shows the lengths that some people will go to in their pursuit of knowledge and understanding.
It does, and it makes me think about, what are those areas in our own lives where we're willing to push ourselves to step outside of our comfort zones and really dive deep?
That's a great question, and is a perfect segue into our next topic, the Voynich manuscript. This one is, well, it's in a league of its own when it comes to unsolved mysteries. It's this medieval text written in an unknown script, unknown language, and it's baffled people for centuries. Really, like, people have been trying to crack this code for I don't know how long, and nobody's been able to figure it out.
So what are the main theories? Like, what do people think it could be?
Well, some people think it's an elaborate code, like some kind of secret message.
Okay, makes sense.
Others think maybe it's a lost language, like a language that's completely vanished and we have no other record of.
Right.
And then there's some who think, maybe it's just the work of a brilliant but maybe troubled mind.
Like someone just making stuff up.
Well, not necessarily making stuff up, but maybe creating their own, private language or something.
It's fascinating though, right? Like this idea that there's this book out there filled with secrets that we just can't unlock.
Yeah, it's tantalizing. It really makes you wonder, what's in there? What are we missing?
Do you think we'll ever crack the code?
It's hard to say, Maybe with advances in technology like AI or something, we might have a better chance.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. Like, could we train a computer to decipher it?
Maybe. I mean, it's been resistant to all human effort so far, so who knows?
Well, hey, maybe one of our listeners will be the one to crack it. Let's shift gears a bit now and talk about some ancient origin stories. Huff spends some time comparing different creation myths from around the world.
Yeah, and one thing that stands out is how often you see these themes of chaos and order, especially in the ancient Near East.
Oh, interesting. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure, like a lot of these creation myths depict the world as emerging from this primordial chaos.
Okay, so like everything's formless and void.
Exactly. And then you have these gods or other powerful beings who come along and impose order. They separate the heavens from the earth, they create light and darkness, all that kind of stuff.
That makes sense, right? Like if you're trying to make sense of the world around you and things seem chaotic and unpredictable, you need some kind of framework to explain it all.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting to contrast those myths with the biblical creation account in Genesis.
Right, because that one has a very different feel to it.
Yeah, in Genesis, you don't really see this struggle between chaos and order.
It's more of a deliberate creation, right?
Exactly. Like God speaks and things come into being.
And there's this emphasis on everything being good.
Yeah, it's a much more, I guess you could say, optimistic view of creation.
Right, like the world isn't born out of conflict, but out of this act of love and intention.
And it's fascinating to think about how those different creation stories might have shaped the beliefs and values of the cultures that embrace them.
It's like those stories become foundational to their worldview, right?
Exactly. It makes you wonder how those stories, those myths, continue to influence us today, even if we don't consciously realize it.
It's like those narratives are woven into our cultural DNA.
And speaking of ancient narratives, let's talk about Göbekli Tepe.
Oh, yes, the mysterious Göbekli Tepe. This site is like a giant question mark in our understanding of ancient history.
Right. Like its age alone is just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
12,000 years old.
12,000 years. That predates, like, everything we thought we knew about the development of complex societies.
Exactly. It's like, whoa, hold on. We need to rewrite the textbooks here.
It challenges all our assumptions about when and how civilization emerged.
Totally. And, there's this one really intriguing feature at the site, the vulture stone.
Oh, yeah, tell me about that one. I've seen pictures. It looks pretty intense.
It does. And some researchers believe it might depict an ancient cataclysmic event, like maybe a comet impact or something.
Seriously, like an ancient record of some kind of global disaster.
It's a theory. And what's even more strange is that the entire site was deliberately buried at some point.
Like they intentionally covered it up.
Yeah, which suggests that it has some deep ritualistic significance.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. It's like they were sealing away a part of their history, their beliefs, for reasons we can only guess at.
It's a mystery.
Yeah.
And I think Göbekli Tepe really forces us to, reconsider what we think we know about the capabilities of early humans.
Yeah, because it's just that they were capable of much more than we previously gave them credit for.
Exactly. Complex societies, sophisticated belief systems, all that stuff might have emerged much earlier than we thought.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it? Like, we like to think of ourselves as so advanced, but then you have these ancient sites that just blow our mind.
It's a good reminder that we don't have all the answers and that there's still so much to learn about the past.
And speaking of ancient civilizations with mysteries galore, let's talk about ancient Egypt.
Ah, yes, the land of pharaohs and pyramids. What's not to love?
Huff mentions the extravagance of the pharaohs' tombs, all the treasures and provisions they were buried with for the afterlife.
It's incredible, right? Like, they really believed they were going to need all that stuff in the next life.
It's a glimpse into a totally different way of thinking about death and the afterlife, isn't it?
It's like, imagine thinking you needed servants and chariots and all your worldly possessions to accompany you into eternity.
I mean, it makes sense if you truly believe that you're just going to continue your existence in another realm, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And, while we're on the subject of ancient Egypt, there's also this ongoing debate about the age of the Sphinx.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that. I've heard some pretty wild theories.
Well, the traditional view is that it was built by the pharaoh Khafre around 2500 BC.
Okay, so that's like 4,500 years ago, give or take.
Right. But some researchers argue that it could be much older, maybe even thousands of years older.
Wow, really? What's the evidence for that?
Well, some point to the erosion patterns on the Sphinx. They say it looks like water erosion, which would suggest it was built during a time when Egypt was much wetter than it is today.
Oh, interesting. So like back when the Sahara Desert was actually a savanna.
That's the idea. And, there are some other geological and astronomical clues that some people have pointed to as well.
It's wild to think that this iconic monument, something we think we know so well, could still hold such profound secrets.
Yeah, it's a reminder that history is always being rewritten as new evidence comes to light.
It's like a never-ending puzzle.
And it's up to us to keep piecing it together, to keep asking questions and seeking answers.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a more philosophical question that's woven throughout the podcast, the human need for meaning.
Yeah, Huff talks about this innate drive we have to understand the universe, to find our place in it all.
It's like we're wired for meaning, aren't we? We crave it.
I think so, yeah. Like, it's this fundamental part of the human experience, this need to make sense of our lives, to find purpose.
To connect with something bigger than ourselves.
Right. And, this drive for meaning finds expression in so many different ways, from religion and spirituality to art and science.
It's like we're constantly seeking answers, whether it's through ancient myths or modern scientific explorations.
And even when we don't find concrete answers, the act of searching itself can be meaningful,
Absolutely. It's about the journey, the exploration, the constant questioning and seeking.
And, Huff mentions the allure of alternative theories, like the idea of the Anunnaki, these ancient alien astronauts.
Yeah, oh yeah, the Anunnaki. That one's a classic.
It's wild, right? But I think it speaks to this hunger we have for explanations, for something beyond the conventional.
Like we want to believe there's more to the story, something hidden, something mysterious.
Yeah, and sometimes those alternative theories, even if they're not, scientifically valid, they can still spark our imaginations and make us think differently about the world.
It's like they tap into this sense of wonder and possibility that maybe we lose sight of as we get older,
And maybe that's okay, right? Like, it's good to keep that childlike curiosity alive, that willingness to entertain different ideas, even if they seem a little out there.
I agree. It's all part of the adventure of being human, this constant quest for knowledge and understanding.
And speaking of quests, let's bring our focus back to Christianity for a moment.
All right, let's do it. So what are some of the key points that Huff raises about Christianity?
Well, he talks about the historical evidence surrounding Jesus.
Okay, so what do we know for sure about Jesus from a historical perspective?
Right, so even sources outside of the Bible confirm that Jesus was a real person, that he was a Jewish preacher who was crucified by the Romans.
So, we have multiple accounts from different perspectives that corroborate those basic facts.
Exactly. And that's important because it establishes a historical foundation for the claims made by Christians.
It's like if you're going to build a belief system, you need a solid foundation to build it on.
Right. But, the claim of Jesus' resurrection, that's where things get a little trickier.
Because that's a supernatural claim, right? It's not something that can be easily verified by historical methods.
Exactly. And Huff acknowledges that it's a challenging concept to grasp, especially from a modern scientific perspective.
Right, because we tend to view the world through a very different lens now, a lens that prioritizes empirical evidence and rationality.
And so how do we make sense of these ancient claims?
Right. How do we reconcile faith and reason when dealing with something like the resurrection?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and I think it's one that each individual has to grapple with on their own terms.
It's like, what evidence would be convincing to you? And how do your own beliefs and biases influence your interpretation of that evidence.
Yeah, and it's important to be aware of those biases, right? To acknowledge that our own worldview shapes how we see the world.
Absolutely. Now, I want to talk about something else that Huff brings up, the formation of the Christian Bible.
Ah, yes, the canon of Scripture.
Like, how did we end up with the Bible as we know it today? What was that process like?
It wasn't a simple process, that's for sure.
It's not like God just handed down a book, right?
There was a lot of debate and discussion among early Christians about which texts should be considered authoritative.
Okay, so like which books were inspired by God and which ones weren't?
Exactly. And they used different criteria, like was the text connected to an apostle or eyewitness? Did it align with Jewish tradition? Did it have sound theology?
So it's like they were trying to sift through all these different writings and figure out which ones best represented the core beliefs of the Christian faith.
And, not every text made the cut. There were a lot of books that were rejected, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, all sorts of stuff.
So it's like a process of elimination, in a way.
Yeah, like what fits and what doesn't.
And you know what else is interesting? Remember that onomastic congruence thing we talked about earlier?
Oh, yeah. The linguistic fingerprint?
Well, it turns out that was used to authenticate biblical texts, too.
Really?
Yeah, like scholars can analyze the names and qualifiers used in a text to see if it matches its claimed time period and location.
That's so good.
It's like a way to test the authenticity of a text based on its language.
And it's been used to debunk some forgeries, too, right?
Exactly. Like the Gospel of Judas, which caused a big stir a few years ago, fails that test.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the analysis suggests it was written much later than claimed and probably originated in Egypt, not Judea.
It's amazing how these seemingly small details can reveal so much.
It's like language itself can hold clues to the past.
It's incredible. And it just shows how important methodology is in historical research.
Because if you're not careful, you can easily get fooled by forgeries or misinterpretations.
Right. You need to have the right tools and methods to analyze the evidence and to separate fact from fiction.
Yeah, it really shows you how much we can learn when we start digging into the nitty-gritty details of language and history.
It's like a whole new way of seeing the past. You know? Like we can use language itself to unlock secrets.
And it underscores something you've been talking about throughout this whole deep dive, the importance of critical thinking.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like we can't just accept things blindly, no matter how convincing they sound or who's saying them.
We've got to be willing to question everything, to look for evidence, and to be okay with being wrong sometimes.
Right. And, I think that's one of the things that makes this Rogan-Huff conversation so valuable. It's not about, presenting some grand unified theory of everything.
It's more about the exploration, right?
Yeah, like they're wrestling with these big ideas, bouncing different perspectives off of each other, and sometimes even disagreeing.
Which is great. Like, disagreement can be productive if it's done respectfully and with a genuine desire to understand.
Totally. It's all part of the learning process, And I think that's something we could all benefit from a little more of these days, a willingness to engage with different perspectives, to have those tough conversations, and to maybe even change our minds once in a while.
I love that. It's like embrace the uncertainty, embrace the messiness of it all.
And, that's what makes history and religion so fascinating. They're not static. They're constantly evolving as we learn more and as we ask new questions.
It's like a never-ending journey.
Exactly. And it's a journey that we can all be a part of, Whether you're a scholar or just someone who's curious about the world, there's always something new to discover.
I think that's a great takeaway for our listeners, this idea that learning is a lifelong process. It doesn't stop when you graduate from school or when you reach a certain age.
Keep that curiosity alive, keep asking questions, and keep exploring.
I love it. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's that one thought-provoking question that you would want our listeners to walk away with?
Okay, here's a challenge for you. Imagine if Jesus returned today, not in some far-off future, but right now in our modern tech-saturated world.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
And imagine he's performing miracles, but it's all happening in the context of virtual reality, augmented reality, deep fakes, all that stuff.
Whoa, that's a mind-bending thought. Like, how would we even know what's real anymore?
Exactly. It blurs the lines between faith and reason, between what we see and what we believe.
Because on one hand, we have all this technology that can create incredibly convincing illusions, right?
Right. So how would we distinguish a genuine miracle from a clever simulation?
It's like, could we even trust our own senses anymore?
And how would that impact our faith, our beliefs, our understanding of reality itself?
Wow, that's heavy stuff. I think
Yeah.
you've given our listeners a lot to chew on.
I hope so. It's a question that I've been wrestling with myself, and I think it's one that's relevant to all of us, regardless of our religious beliefs or lack thereof.
It really makes you think about the nature of truth, the nature of reality, and how those things are constantly being challenged and reshaped in our modern world.
It's exciting and a little scary all at the same time.
Definitely. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been an incredible conversation, and I feel like I've learned so much.
It's been a pleasure, really. I always enjoy these opportunities to explore these big ideas and to share them with others.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of ancient texts, modern mysteries, and the enduring questions that continue to challenge and inspire us.
We encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep seeking those aha moments that enrich our understanding of the world.
And remember, learning is a lifelong adventure, so never stop digging deeper, never stop challenging your assumptions, and never stop being curious.
Because who knows what amazing discoveries await us just around the corner.
That's a great way to put it. Until next time, keep seeking those hidden truths and keep expanding your horizons. Or say it.
Alex and Ivy got tales to share. Life in general, we go everywhere. From politics to soul repair. Tune in now, we got time to spare.